Welcome everyone to the Data Simplified event for July, AI and Data Ethics for Leaders. And with us today, we have Olga Mack. Olga, welcome. Give
Oh,
us
hello.
yeah, it's nice to have you. Want to give us a little rundown about you, what you've been working on? I,
Yeah, well, hello, Nancy. Good to be with you. I'm a tech lawyer by design. Most recently, I've had many entrepreneurial adventures. I sold and integrated a company into LexisNexis and continue focusing on building the future of law at Stanford Codex and law.mit, publishing a couple of books and doing various things to support the community. I'm really excited about this conversation with you.
us too. Thank you, Olga. So you've done a lot. And I wanted to highlight that the focus of our discussion today is going to be exploring the ethical implications of AI and data usage in business and how to navigate them. So it sounds like a little bit of a mouthful, but I know that with our expert here, we'll be able to break it down into digestible little portions. So if you're ready, Olga, let's begin. Sounds good?
Let's do it.
All right. So let's start off with the basics. So what are data ethics of AI? When we say that, what are we referring to?
Yeah, no, it's a really good question. It's actually a right place to start. Many folks answer that question by focusing on legalities of it, sort of
Mm,
obtaining permissions, the privacy, the security part of it. And to me, those are legal elements. You
mhm,
have to do them. That's a floor. Ethics is, I would call, a ceiling, and we sometimes use many words to describe that. We use words like ethics, integrity, and other words. And those words have overlapping meanings. They also have slightly different meanings. But let's just say, without becoming a Webster's dictionary or a Black Law dictionary, let's just say the focus is on doing the right thing. And
mhm,
ultimately, what it means in the context of a company, building trust. It all comes down to trust. And then the focus on data here is that the unit in most disruptive new technologies, including AI, Gen AI, is data. So
mhm.
it's really hard to have a meaningful conversation about anything, laws, ethics, whatever, without focusing on sort of a unit of the discussion, which is data. So that's why when we talk about Gen AI, we often very quickly start discussing data.
I like that. Thank you. So why is that important though?
Wow. That's a very long conversation as to why. I think for maybe increasingly, not the first time, but increasingly, technologies not just have a big impact on us and maybe our immediate community or maybe even companies, they have much bigger exponential impact that could be felt everywhere.
Mm,
And so every technology, from invention of will to forward, has raised at least some sort of ethical concerns, and some sort of questions about what is the right thing to do, how should our life change, are we ready for it? But in the context of Gen AI, where the impact could be potentially so large
mhm,
and could have unintended consequences and could hit well beyond yourself, your immediate community, and company, the question of ethics becomes increasingly important. That combined with the fact that we have relatively little trust in our institutions, there are a number of surveys that measure trust in the world, in our society, in the United States specifically, and it is pretty much at all times low. So the combination of the two makes the question of ethics, and specifically the right thing to do, because ethics usually just sort of very normative question depending on specific society or unit of folks that we're looking at, but really the right thing to do, very important.
that's good. I like that. And then, so earlier, Olga, you said that, we're we're not Webster's here. We're not talking about, dictionaries and bunch of meanings and things. But I know that in our discussion we said that there's like a new data vocabulary for ethics.
Yeah, I think the language is
Hmm.
still unfolding. We have some
Developing.
language.
Hmm.
We do still have some language, but even, if you talk to ethicists, they'll tell you that the word ethics is the wrong term to use. And if you look at what companies hire, they increasingly hire integrity officers. And integrity is a slightly different word. It's rooted closer to the company's mission and vision as opposed to country's norms. And so it's sort of trying to make a narrower stab at how to measure what is the right thing to do. And then the same thing with data. We have some vocabulary around how to talk about data. There's this whole art and science of statistics. And we have a lot of words and ways to measure accuracy of predictions. But when it comes to data in the context of AI, it's useful to break it down at least into three elements. It's useful to break it down into input, what happens in the black box, and output. And for those, let's just say three large sections, there are different questions you would ask with respect to data. For example, with respect to input, we increasingly ask questions around origin. Where did this data come from? And specifically, we ask questions: at what point do we know enough? Like, how far back do we need to go to understand the origin of something? Is it one generation back, two generation back? At what point do we know enough to say that this is good data? And the vocabulary around this origin of data and where it comes from and how it changed over time and whether it was polluted and cleaned well, all of that is actually being developed as we speak. There are a number of nonprofits and for-profit companies that very much working very hard to uplevel our conversation, the sophistication of our conversation around data, so that we can more thinly slice the integrity of the data we're looking at, say, at input, for example.
Hmm. I like that breakdown to three main things. I'm a thinker like that. I need to put things in
I, I
small
find I
small
find
pieces.
structured thinking really helps
Yeah.
break down, because the questions you ask at input in the black box and output are slightly different, right?
Yes.
And so it's helpful to, at a minimum, and actually I would say as we become more sophisticated within each of those steps, we will probably have further breakdowns. Those are the
Breakdowns.
minimum breakdowns.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason it's helpful is because we do different things to data at those stages, and to have meaningful conversations from which we can grow and build on, and build specifically good ethical practices that makes us feel good about our impact on the world, doing the right thing, that is to say, we need to sort of have a vocabulary to talk about.
Yes, yes. And because you were talking about AI, you mentioned Gen AI and you were talking about outputs. What are the ethical points that we would have to keep in mind in terms of AI, like responsible AI or ethical implications?
For the output,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
yeah, output is very interesting because, I think, because remember, as I mentioned, this is a technology that could have impact at scale.
Mm-hmm.
And so thinking about things like unintended consequences, and this is not a new concept. It has developed a long time ago.
Right.
There's sort of enough economics theory around it, how to do it well, and a lot of examples in the history of the world where, you do one thing and it has this massive unintended consequences. So we've seen this before in nature, for example. Um, the the challenge with AI is that you can have those events more often, much more frequently,
Mm-hmm.
and with a higher impact. And so it puts pressure for us to think through what could possibly go wrong. What am I not thinking about? And the best tool we have for that is essentially scenario playing, looking at some historical data, imagining the world today, seeing what could possibly go wrong. So, scenario playing is essentially how we deal with unintended consequences today. I do think that we will become much more sophisticated, and if you actually played with things like ChatGPT, it's actually really good at predicting what could possibly go wrong. So we can actually leverage AI to help us think through possible and less likely scenarios, and are we prepared for that? I think that that's one thing. Um, there are quite a few other things. For example, um, I think for most of technology history, we were sort of satisfied with looking at intent. Do I have
Hmm.
good intentions? Do I mean no harm? How do I show up in the world? I think with Gen AI and frankly new technologies generally, we ask a much deeper question, the question of disparate impact. Uh, Disparate impact is a legal theory. It's often used in employment discrimination, for example, where, for example, you may have very good intentions in your employment practices, but practically speaking, they exclude groups of people
Mm.
systematically and therefore illegal. And if you apply that type of theory of disparate impact, I think it's very useful to look in a context of AI through that lens because it forces you to, yes, look at your intent, acknowledge that good intent is not enough.
No.
It doesn't matter whether it comes from heart or head at some point if it has really bad um, impact on the world, and forces us as leaders to think through scenarios, likely, unlikely, survey our peers, maybe leverage technology, and just more systematically, not just look at intent, but look at impact.
The impact. So okay, so you talked about unintended consequences, and then to, work through those, so to avoid that, I should say, we want to have the scenarios, right? This role playing. And I love that
Unintended
suggestion.
consequences, by the way, could be positive.
Right. Yes,
They
absolutely.
don't have to be negative.
Negative, right? A
And
lot of,
what
yes,
is useful to know what they are so you can plan for,
to plan
for
accordingly.
both. Obviously it's good to plan for bad things, but
Yeah.
honestly, planning for good things is maybe even more fun.
It's a welcomed outcome, but it's unexpected and nonetheless. Yeah. Um, so and I love the suggestion about using AI, and like the chat GPT example, right? Ask it, help it work through, the possible scenarios that can go down. Can you think though of like real world examples where that, when it's like a success? Like they took things into accountability, and they, did the scenarios, and then the outcome was unexpected or planned, whatnot, but that it was a positive outcome.
Um, there a lot of success happens every day. It's not always shared. But I have seen, for example, I'm very fascinated by insurance as a mechanism and a tool to
Hmm.
manage risks,
Okay.
and we increasingly have this great technology, powerful technology, and I've seen, for example, insurance underwriters and reinsurers, basically folks who insure the insurance, which is a very important function. And insurance serves a very important function in our society. Like many events would not happen, many businesses would not happen if we didn't have insurance. The most important question we ask when we run a business, for example, having advised many boards, is protection during cyber event, one of the
Hmm.
events that is highly uncertain, and you can imagine that that could be an AI event as well. But I've now talked to a lot of insurance professionals, those that do the underwriting process, but also those that do reinsuring process. And I actually asked one of them point blank, you just took an aggregate of insurance in some unusual thing that you know nothing about. How do you know about possible risks? And they say, oh, we know. And I was like, no, no, tell me how. And
Yeah.
they're like,
How?
How? Like, tell me how. How do you know what could possibly go wrong in the middle of the ocean on the boat when you have 1,000 people? Other than the obvious things like fire. What else? Because you seem to have a list of what could happen, say, near Dubai. And they say, actually, fine. We just asked ChatGPT, and it actually seems to come up with really good
Oh,
list of
wow.
what could possibly go wrong. And I thought this is brilliant. Then I said, well, what do you do with that list? And they say, well, we just, folks who actually did individual insurance, we ask them, have you thought about it? And they're like, oh, yes, we have. Or no, we
No,
never
we
thought
haven't.
about
Yeah.
it.
I love
Or hey, this is on.
confessions of an insurance agent.
Anyway, all of that to say
Yeah.
is that you can use technology to solve a lot of the challenges. And so, like,
Yeah.
I can definitely imagine thinking through scenario playing and thinking through things like unintended consequences or impact, disparate impact. I think this is where technology could be incredibly helpful. And as we collect
Mhm.
more and more data of unintended or intended consequences, I think our technology will become really much better at playing scenarios and helping us make educated decisions around our actions.
Mhm. Yeah, and I love that example of insurance is great, especially with the risk stuff. And it's a very, very real thing. Thank you. That's a good one. So, how do we make sure that organizations are doing the right thing?
Oh, there's a few things we can do. And, or speaking about organizations, like it's a monolith is very misleading. They're kind of like people, unique and special snowflakes, each one is none like another. So it's really kind of, talking in generalities is not is a lot is lost in the translation. But I would say this is where leadership matters quite a lot.
Hmm.
Uh, this is where a few leaders at the top, the board can set the tone, provide examples. I personally tend to think of things like the manual and a checklist. And I recently did a TEDx talk about the importance of that. There are other words that people use in the corporate America, like policies and stuff like that. But using sort of lay term words, a
Hmm.
manual and a checklist. And the reason I use those words is that, look, Gen AI, any new technology, is essentially heavy machinery. It's like a crane. It's not a shovel, it's a crane. And we would never let somebody who hasn't had proper training, hasn't read the manual,
Operate.
operate this thing.
Hmm.
We would ask them to like read the manual. We may even
Get
require them
trained.
to get a certification and the training and have an apprenticeship and have a professional watch them and then have some test and like on and on and on. So that manual is incredibly important. And so as leaders, we can set it up. We can set up sort of larger goals and values and missions, and then manuals that are consistent with that. And then checklists. Every profession that has essentially lives, money on the line will have a checklist. Your doctor, your nurses, they all have a checklist.
I
It's
agree.
called
Yeah.
standard of care. That's a legal term for that. It's the standard of care. Essentially, the question is, did you do the 5 essential things on the checklist? From
Hmm.
washing your hands to using the right equipment. And it turns out this thing like checklist really improves outcomes. You give professional a checklist and require them with this sort of legal standard of care to follow it, otherwise it's malpractice. It turns out it has a massive impact of decreasing the malpractice and bad outcomes. So as leaders, setting up sort of mission and vision, making sure we set up manuals that incorporate the mission and the vision and specific to our organizations. And then for every function, we create the checklists. So people systematically, not as a random act of showing up to work, but systematically do the right thing. That is how you get to that what is the right thing to do every day. That is how, as an organization, you build trust.
And that's what it comes back to. Right, trust. So
Trust.
so let's say a business leader is watching this and they're like, okay, so I need to do that. So what steps can they take? I love the idea of the manual checklist, but what else should they do? Like just to kick off. Who should they
Yeah.
involve?
I mean, proverbial everyone.
Right.
It takes a leader to start, right? It's very important for that initiative to come from the CEO and the board, and to outline, to one, be enthusiastic, explain why it's important, and kind of present the timeline and the goal and all of that. But I think with things like compliance, legal stuff, and the right thing to do, it's not just risk job, or it's not just legal job or compliance job. It's everybody's job. So once you have the manual and the checklist, the third piece of that is training.
Mm,
It's kicked off. Everybody is involved and provides an input. You create manuals and checklists, and then you continuously training. And basically that's the life cycle of stuff we have in most companies today. If you look at any compliance, whether it's privacy, security, SEC compliance, financials, disclosure, they all loosely follow this structure of having policies and educations and checklists to make sure that compliance is not a random act of compliance, or doing the right thing is not a random act of doing the right thing, but actually
it's
systematically, without
planned.
thinking, people are doing the right thing.
I like it. Yeah. And so because it's like you said, everyone is involved and leaders have to, head that up. How do we build an ethical data culture, data practice for the business?
Yeah, I think, I mean, how that's it's a really big how, but one of the things we need to start thinking is how we evaluate our human capital. What does it mean to be a good employee today? We historically put goals related to, say, sales target. And we tolerate, for example, people who may be not as trustworthy. There's a term for that. We call them toxic. And the corporate America, because it's focused a lot on performance and less on other things, tolerates sometimes, depending on the company, toxicity.
Mm,
We need to actively rank stakeholders and contributors, not just on performance, because I think performance is table stakes. If you were not performing, you wouldn't be here.
there, right.
But
Remove you.
things like trust, doing the right thing, being a good person, having integrity, supporting your teammates, those are increasingly important skills. Doing the right things during uncertainty, incorporating that much more into goals, and kind of even testing for it in the same way. For example, organizations now test whether or not you will be clicking on the wrong link and expose
Right.
the entire organization. Valuing things other than performance, and actively facilitating and training and measuring that, I think is very important. I think that's how we systematically hire right people that we trust, that don't only perform, because you know who is the toxic person in the company. You show up in the company and you ask, and everybody will point a finger to that person. And then you ask a question: why is this person
Or are they still
tolerated?
here?
Why? Because everyone knows who it is. It's not a secret.
Yeah.
And somebody will say, oh, that's because they're performing or they're managing up very well. That tells you a lot about this organization. And in the age of AI, where we essentially one mistake away by anyone on a team, that is a risk. And it's not an individual person or team risk, it's a company risk.
Company
And
risk.
the board must manage it, and the CEO must show less tolerance for that.
take action. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, well, this has been a great discussion. I love everything that we've discussed today. I just before we wrap up, there was one last thing I wanted to bring up here, and I wanted to get your take on that, Olga. Where do you see this going in future? Like predicting the future of the AI and data ethics in the business world.
Well, about the thing about predicting. We as human species, this is not an Olga thing, this is not a technologist thing, this is not a lawyer thing. We are generally not designed to be really good at predicting. That's just
No,
not
we're
our
not.
core competency. We get it wrong every time. So for example, right before the Great Depression, we predicted some wildly good economics and uplift, and then no one saw pandemic coming, no one. So with these two epic failures in mind, let me make some predictions. How about that? I think, as I said, the discussions around ethics and integrity and like generally what is the right thing to do will have a richer vocabulary. We will have a much better distinction in our mind what's the difference between ethics and laws and integrity and many other things. I think we will have more systems and structures to systematically make decisions, and
Mm,
hopefully we'll start training folks. And it will have a much broader reach than we even can imagine today. So for example, the ethical use of AI will not just include things like, privacy and unintended consequences and stuff like that. It will include things like environmental impact.
mm,
The thing about new technologies, whether it's, crypto or AI, they are, depending how they're designed and how they're set up and how they're used, they may have actually a devastating impact on the environment. And we are now beginning to discuss that. That is one unintended consequence that is worth discussing,
yes, absolutely.
because one company's or one person's use can have a devastating impact on nations who maybe not. And I think we will have indices and more mature conversations when it comes to AI ethics and integrity that will very explicitly talk about the environmental impact. We now see kind of more sophisticated conversation around environmental issues worldwide, including the United States, definitely in Europe. And the conversations around AI impact are there. They're not quite as big, but yes, that's what we should expect. We should expect the convergence of many issues related to DNI, environmental, all the things we've talked about before to be part of this and to be much more sophisticated and have systems around it.
Yeah, and more accountability, I can see for sure, being
Yes,
taken into account, right? Yeah.
yes.
So,
We will expect much more from our leaders for sure.
mm-hmm. Yeah, which you should.
Yes.
You absolutely should. Wow, this has been a great discussion. Uh, I've enjoyed meeting with you, Olga, asking these questions, and thank you for being patient and answering them all. So, if there's anything else, well, I wanted to share before we go. I have resources that Olga has been so generous with us to share. Um, Resources that she is recommending. Some what is it? Some MIT talks that you've shared. Also, right? Some links on YouTube for us to
Yeah,
watch.
I've shared a couple of things. I've shared some frameworks that I published on law at MIT, where I talked about the unintended consequences, disparate impact as well. And then two of my recent TEDx talks, one around this concept of a manual and a checklist, which is, I think, increasingly important, that
Hmm.
could be applied from everyday life to your company, to your nation. And then the second TEDx talk that I recently have done about the way to look at AI as a partner, which requires not only for us to understand what it is, but also show up as a partner that adds value and understand what is the role of a human in this partnership and how to become a valuable partner.
Really good. Yeah, definitely must watch. So please take a screenshot. This all information also will be available once the podcast goes live or is shared on Spotify and YouTube. And then tune in next month, actually August 1st, for our next subject is going to be maximizing ROI with AI investments. So definitely everyone will want to make sure to be present for that. Thank you again, Olga, for everything, and we'll be talking soon. Have a good day,
Thank you,
everyone.
Nancy. Bye, everyone.